St Giles Files.
Hello, welcome to this week's episode of St Giles Files. It's just me here again, and this week I'll be talking about the memorials in St Giles. So as usual, I'll start off with a specific item. This will be the Margaret Oliphant Memorial. Then I will widen the scope to the whole of St Giles memorials, and then I'll push it out to a wider debate on memorials in general. Right, so Margaret Oliphant. Well, I'll give you a bit of background on who Margaret Oliphant is and why she deserved a memorial in St Giles. So Margaret Oliphant was a writer. She was a writer in the 19th century. But before she became a writer, she was whisked off to Rome with her husband. He got a job, she followed and took the kids, and then he promptly died. Not very helpful. But even less helpful was the £1,000 of debt, roughly, that she inherited from him. Not very useful at all. But she decided not to let things get her down. She moved back to Britain and she started writing, which got her out of her immediate debt hole and then a lot more. She was incredibly prolific with writing. I think unfairly often thought to be a romantic novelist in a not kind way, but I think that's doing her a disservice. And her brother also came to live with her, so she not only supported her family and her immediate family and children and her brother. So a very good writer. And as a result, she gets a memorial in St Giles. But this isn't a podcast about Margaret Oliphant. This is a podcast about memorials this week. So, the memorial itself. Well, maybe it's better to start with how one gets a memorial in St Giles. At this point, well, at Margaret Oliphant's memorial's point, you had to apply to the management board. Now, the management board it seems to be a pretty subjective board in that you apply to make a change to St Giles Cathedral and they say yes or no. So if you wanted a memorial, you could apply to them and say, we'd like to put a memorial in St Giles to this person or this group. And then the management board would say yes or no. In this case, Margaret Oliphant, yes. Originally, though, her memorial was in the Albany Isle. But once it became dedicated after the Second World War as the War Memorial Isle, it was Margaret Oliphant's memorial was then put in the area we see it now. It's a reasonably large memorial for a single person, relatively to the rest of our memorials. And it is, as you'll see from the picture that I'll put on the website, it's in gold leaf. And it was done by a man called Pittenberg McGilvery, a great name. He also did a few other memorials in the building, the most notable example being the sculpture of John Knox. So that's Margaret Oliphant's memorial, and also how one can have a memorial put into St Giles. The location of Margaret Oliphant's memorial then is in an area that we refer to as Writer's Corner. Now, there has been debate over whether this is officially Writer's Corner or unofficially has become known as that. There is no documented evidence that it was ever officially named Writer's Corner. The only documented evidence we have is William Chambers saying that he wants to have an area analogous to Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. But the physical evidence would point to the fact that there is a Writer's Corner. Margaret Oliphant finds herself surrounded by loads of other writers, including Robert Louis Stevenson, Robert Ferguson, John Stuart Blackie. And the window in that area contains lots of prominent biblical writers. So I think it's fair enough to call the area Writer's Corner. Possibly it doesn't need to have a separate name in the way that Poets' Corner does in Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey having lots of different corners to different sectors of society, whereas in St Giles it's, largely writers or war memorials, but I'll speak more about that later. But there are a few other fun memorials around St Giles. One of my other favourites is to a man called John Craig. Now, for those of you that don't know, St Giles does allow dogs into the cathedral, and we believe that it's because of John Craig. John Craig was a man who was heavily linked with John Knox, and he found himself to the point of starvation and death. And there are 3 versions of the story: that a dog came to him in real life with some sustenance and nursed John Craig back to health, or the dog came to him in a dream, or the dog was his all along. But essentially, John Craig liked dogs, and so his memorial has a dog on it. That's one of my favourite memorials. The other one, though, is to a man called Dean Hannay. Now, for those of you that know your St Giles history, you will know exactly who Dean Hannay is. But for those of you that don't, Dean Hannay was the unfortunate man who had to read the Charles I's Anglican service. So Dean Hannay's memorial in the cathedral says, "To James Hannay, Dean of this cathedral, 1634 to 1639. He was the first and last who read the service book in this church. This memorial is erected in happier times by his descendant." So essentially what that means is Dean Hannay got up to read the service book, the English Anglican service book. Jenny Geddes, our potentially fictional woman, threw her stool at him and said she'll not have mass preached in this church, and he ran away. He ran away. So that's another one of my favourite memorials. And then this is one that very few people will have seen, but there's a memorial just outside. Well, it's a banner memorial, so it's not a stone and metal memorial, but it is to the youth of St Giles, and on the back of it is embroidered "Glory to God in the High Street," which, for those of you who are very good with words, you will notice the play on words that highest, if you take the E out, becomes High Street. So those are a few of the memorials I thought I would mention. One of the memorials that I find the oddest is the one actually that's also in Writer's Corner, and potentially disproves the fact that Writer's Corner even exists. But this is the memorial to chloroform, and it reads, "Thank God for James Young Simpson's discovery of chloroform anaesthesia in 1847. Now, I'm not about to get into a discussion as to who we should thank for the discovery. I just think it's an odd memorial, because there are lots of things we can be thankful for. It seems very odd to single out chloroform as one of them and put a memorial to it on the wall. I mean, I appreciate it's an Edinburgh invention and a medical necessity, or was a medical necessity. Now we have better forms of anaesthesia, I suppose. But it just seems, quite an odd thing to be thankful for on the wall of a cathedral. That was the only reason I brought it up. I think it's odd. It's funny. So those are a few of my favourite memorials in the cathedral. If anyone wants to, do share your favourite memorials on the website and or the Facebook, and I'll publicise people's favourite memorials. To carry on from odd memorials, I suppose, is the odd lack of a certain memorial. This being the gender imbalance of memorials in St Giles. Now, amongst Edinburgh folk, there's a joke that there are more memorials to dogs than women in Edinburgh. A side note, one of my favourite memorials to a dog in Edinburgh is the memorial to the dog named Bum, which you can find in Princess Street Gardens, just near the King's Stable Road entrance. But there is truth to that, I think, that there are only 2 memorials to women in the whole of Edinburgh, and there are 3 to dogs. Now, while St Giles isn't doing that badly, I think we probably could do better. We have memorials to Sophia Jex-Blake and Elsie Ingalls, the prominent doctors. We have a memorial to the previously mentioned, potentially fictional, Jenny Geddes. We also have a memorial to the Scottish nurses who died in the First World War, and there are a few windows who are in memorial to women, but certainly outweighed by the number of memorials to individual men. And this leads me on to what we could do better in the future with our memorials. Now, unfortunately, we aren't in the position of Westminster Abbey, where they have so much wall space that they can keep going with memorials to different people, and more importantly, current people. St Giles doesn't have that luxury. Pretty much all of our wall space is taken up now by memorials. The only wall space we have free is the east wall, which is left purposefully blank. We've even had to take some memorials down to put new memorials up. But this raises the question then as to whether we should take old memorials down in favour of new memorials, because the current generation and even the previous generation of Scots haven't had a place to be memorialised. And I wonder, and whilst I don't like to make this comparison with Westminster Abbey, as you'll have seen in previous episodes of the podcast, I wonder if Westminster Abbey almost functions as a secular, spiritual remembrance place in some way, remembering people like Stephen Hawking, that Scotland doesn't necessarily have, that St Giles could function as that, one, if we had more wall space or we were ready to take memorials down, and whether it is useful to have such a place of remembrance. The War Memorial, obviously, in the castle is just for war. Is there somewhere that people can go to remember prominent Scottish people, and could St Giles be it? I don't have an answer for that, but I'm just posing that as a question, because we did fulfil that function up until the wars allowed us. So should we be thinking about fulfilling that function again? And this leads me helpfully onto the topic I've chosen for our wider debate this week, moving it past just St Giles. Can memorials become inappropriate? Now, this is a tricky subject, and I'm not for one instant suggesting that memorials are absolutely inappropriate. I think memorials were always appropriate in their time. It's just whether our glasses of today, I suppose, would see them as inappropriate, in the same way that jokes or TV shows that were made at the time now can be viewed with a different lens in our current understanding of the world. Obviously, the main thing I'm talking about here is war memorials. Now, most of our war memorials, I think, are absolutely fine, that they remember men and women who gave their lives for our freedoms. But I suppose one of the memorials I'm thinking of in particular, which is a particularly tricky memorial, is a memorial to men, women and children who died in India. They actually died of cholera. And I suppose whilst memorialising them and the tragedy that happened there is something we should be doing, I can imagine someone coming over and seeing that memorial, coming from India, seeing that memorial and then thinking, well, where's the corresponding memorial to all the people that the British Empire killed in India? You know, they would be perfectly legitimate in feeling aggrieved that we're memorialising people who died as a result of their participation in the colonial structure a bit galling.
Especially when there's no memorial to their relatives or ancestors who were the victims of that colonial structure.
And I suppose whilst I'm not suggesting we take the memorial down, I am asking what is the appropriate response to it? And I wonder if the appropriate response is that we remain completely and utterly open to having a corresponding memorial that remembers the victims of colonialism. Because I think it's fair to say that we have this memorial because it was for British people who died, and we aren't very good at remembering other people's unless they are right in front of us. For example, there's a memorial from the French state thanking the Scots that died in the First World War. And I think if there was a larger Indian population in Edinburgh, there might well be a memorial to remember those that died as a result of colonialism.
I'm just going to squeeze a quick edit in here because it was something I was thinking about after I recorded this originally. I was wondering whether it's our responsibility to put a memorial up to the people, victims of colonialism. And then I thought it probably isn't, because it's not up to us how we memorialise the victims. And I think we stray into the realms of being prescriptive with memorials, which may cause even more offence. So, yeah, I think that the duty for us is just to be ready to accept a memorial if one is forthcoming, and if not, to be aware of our past and have learned from it and acknowledge it and apologise for it. Right, that's the end of the edit. Back to original me.
So yeah, I think we have to be careful of our memorials that remember history in a way that which we can now say is wrong and should be changed. And whilst we accept that our memorials weren't created by an omnipotent power who knew everything that was going on, they were created by people at the time who were remembering other people, we can now see those memorials as still valid but then also remember people that may have been forgotten. And that conclusion should, I believe, be applied to St Giles in general, in that we should try and remember a more representative cross-section of society rather than just the top-down big man approach to history. And hopefully a little less war. One of the questions we get most often is why there's so many war memorials in this church, and part of the reason is there was a good bit of war which hopefully we can avoid in the future, and we can remember people who have done other things than been involved in war.
Right, well, I think that will do for today. We've covered a good deal of ground from Margaret Oliphant to what we should do for new memorials. I'll speak to you soon.
Part of the reason that I am doing this on my own is some staff have been furloughed at St Giles, but St Giles is doing a great job of topping their salary up, so everyone is still being paid 100% of their salary at St Giles. But the only way we can do that is by donations. And at the moment, given that people can't come into St Giles, we're getting very few of them. Please, 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 if you enjoyed the podcast, do give it a small donation if you can. Thanks. Bye-bye.